The day my husband told me he was leaving, the kitchen smelled like burnt toast and overbrewed coffee, and for a moment I thought the strange tension in the air had something to do with the weather. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, the kind of ordinary day that usually disappears from memory, yet that one moment has stayed with me for 35 years as clearly as if it happened yesterday. He stood across the table from me with his hands resting on the back of a chair, not sitting down, not pacing, just standing there like someone who had rehearsed a difficult conversation 100 times in his head before finally saying it out loud. I remember noticing the way he avoided my eyes at first, as though eye contact might make the words harder to say, and that small detail made the room feel colder than it actually was. After 24 years of marriage, I believed I knew every expression on his face, every hesitation in his voice, every little habit that revealed what he was thinking. But that evening, the man standing in my kitchen felt strangely unfamiliar. The clock above the stove ticked loudly in the silence while he shifted his weight slightly, his fingers tightening around the back of the chair as if he were bracing himself for something inevitable. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke, and the quiet stretched across the room in a way that made the air feel heavy. Then he finally cleared his throat, looked somewhere past my shoulder instead of at me, and said the sentence that would quietly erase the life we had built together. "I'm leaving," he said, like someone announcing a minor decision rather than the end of a marriage that had lasted nearly a quarter of a century. "Hello there, my dear. I'm truly glad you stopped by. Welcome to Voice of Granny June, a little corner where I share the kind of stories that only time and life can teach. Stories shaped by love, family, mistakes, forgiveness, and the lessons we gather along the way. Now, let's go back to where we left off." For a moment, I honestly thought he was joking, because people don't usually destroy 24 years of shared history in a single calm sentence. But the seriousness in his voice made it clear he had already decided long before walking into that kitchen. What surprised him most wasn't that I understood what he meant, but the way I reacted when the words finally settled into the room between us. Instead of crying or shouting or asking the questions people expect in moments like that, I simply smiled at him across the table, and the confusion that crossed his face told me he hadn't prepared for that response at all. The truth is that something strange happened inside my mind during those few seconds after he spoke, something quiet and irreversible that I didn't fully understand until years later, because trust does not always break in loud, dramatic ways. Sometimes it disappears silently, like a light turning off in a room you didn't realize had been growing dim for months. I remember stirring my coffee slowly while he began explaining things I barely heard, phrases about being unhappy and needing a different life. The kind of explanations people often borrow from movies when they want to make betrayal sound reasonable. The details of what he said that night don't matter very much anymore, because the most important thing had already happened the moment he decided to walk away from 24 years without looking back. I watched him speak while realizing that the man in front of me had already left long before he ever said the words, and that understanding brought a strange calm instead of anger. Later, friends would ask me how I stayed so composed in that moment, but the truth was simpler than they expected. Something inside me had quietly closed, and once that door closed, it never really opened again. That evening was not only the end of my marriage, it was the beginning of a decision I didn't know I was making at the time. Because after that night, even though I didn't realize it yet, I would never fully trust another man again. And strangely enough, it wasn't even the divorce itself that caused that decision. It was something he said later that evening, a single sentence spoken almost casually while he packed a small suitcase by the bedroom door. I didn't understand the weight of that sentence at the time, but over the next 35 years, it would echo in my memory more clearly than the moment he said he was leaving. Because sometimes the words that destroy your faith in someone aren't the loud ones that end a marriage. Sometimes they are the quiet ones that come afterward. When people hear that my husband left me after 24 years, they usually assume the marriage must have been unhappy for a long time, as if betrayal only grows out of constant arguments or quiet resentment. The truth is much more confusing than that, because for most of those 24 years our life looked completely ordinary, the kind of life people describe as stable and dependable. We were not the sort of couple who shouted across rooms or slammed doors during disagreements, and we were not the type who lived dramatic lives full of passion and chaos either. Instead, our days moved in comfortable routines that slowly stitched themselves together into something that looked very much like security. We bought a modest house during our 5th year of marriage, the kind with a small backyard and a front porch that caught the afternoon sun. And for a long time, that porch became the place where we ended most evenings talking about work, neighbors, and plans that always seemed to stretch comfortably into the future. At the time, I believed those routines meant something permanent, because ordinary habits have a way of convincing you that tomorrow will always look like today. Looking back now, I realized that what we called stability was really just familiarity, and familiarity can sometimes hide the quiet changes that are happening right in front of you. But during those years, I never questioned it, because nothing in his behavior suggested that one evening he would stand in our kitchen and calmly tell me he was leaving. And certainly nothing in those ordinary days prepared me for the strange sentence he would say later that night, the one that would echo in my mind for the next 35 years. Our marriage had grown the way most long marriages do, through thousands of small shared moments rather than a few grand romantic gestures. And those moments made the relationship feel solid in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who has never lived inside that kind of rhythm. We woke up at nearly the same time every morning, moving around each other in the kitchen without thinking, the quiet choreography of two people who had memorized each other's habits after years of repetition. He always read the newspaper at the table while drinking his coffee, occasionally commenting on a headline that neither of us would remember by the afternoon. And I often listened while packing his lunch for work like it was the most natural routine in the world. On weekends, we visited the grocery store together, argued mildly about which brand of coffee tasted better, and sometimes drove across town just to eat at a diner that served pancakes exactly the way he liked them. None of those moments felt extraordinary at the time, but together they created the comfortable illusion that our lives were firmly connected in ways that could not easily be undone. I remember believing that trust worked like a structure built slowly over years, something that became stronger the longer it stood. Friends sometimes joked that we were a predictable couple, the kind who would probably grow old sitting on that same porch watching the neighborhood change around us. Hearing those comments always made me smile, because I believed the same thing myself without questioning it. What I understand now, many years later, is that ordinary love can sometimes be the hardest kind to examine closely, because its calm surface makes you assume nothing important is changing underneath. There were small moments in the later years of our marriage when he seemed distracted or distant, but they were easy to explain away at the time, because everyone goes through stressful periods at work or moments of quiet restlessness in life. If someone had asked me during those years whether I trusted my husband completely, I would have answered yes without hesitation, not because I had carefully evaluated that trust, but because I had grown used to assuming it existed. Trust, after all, often feels less like a decision and more like a habit you forget to question. That is why the night he told me he was leaving felt so unreal at first, because it forced me to confront the uncomfortable possibility that something inside our marriage had been changing long before I noticed it. During those 24 years, our life looked steady enough that no one around us suspected anything was wrong, including me. But looking back now, I can see that the quiet rhythm of our ordinary days had already begun to shift in small ways I didn't recognize at the time. The truth is that nothing dramatic happened at first, no sudden betrayal and no obvious warning signs. Instead, the changes arrived slowly, so quietly that I barely noticed them until much later. And the strange thing about small changes is that they rarely feel important when they begin. But sometimes those small changes are exactly where the end of a marriage quietly starts. The strange thing about the small changes in a marriage is that they rarely arrive in ways that feel dramatic or alarming at the time. They slip quietly into everyday life, disguised as ordinary stress or temporary distraction. And because they appear so harmless in the moment, you rarely stop to examine them closely. Looking back now, I can see that the changes in my husband began long before the night he stood in the kitchen and told me he was leaving. But at the time, each one seemed too small to question. He started coming home a little later from work, sometimes explaining that the office had been busy or that a project was taking longer than expected. And those explanations sounded reasonable enough that I never felt the need to doubt them. Every marriage goes through periods where work becomes demanding or routines shift slightly. So I treated those late evenings as a normal part of life rather than something unusual. Sometimes he would walk through the door with a distracted expression, as though his mind were still somewhere else. And when I asked if everything was all right, he would simply say he was tired and needed a quiet evening. I believed him because that is what people in long marriages tend to do. They believe the explanations that maintain the calm rhythm of their shared life. It never occurred to me that those small moments of distance might be the beginning of something larger, because nothing about them looked dramatic enough to deserve suspicion. Another change arrived so gradually that I almost didn't notice it at all. And that was the way he began paying a little more attention to things that had never mattered much to him before. He started buying new shirts more often, sometimes stopping by the store after work with small shopping bags that he placed casually on the bedroom chair as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. At first, I assumed it had something to do with his job, perhaps a new expectation at the office or simply a desire to look more professional. And because those explanations made sense, I never questioned them. He also began shaving more carefully in the mornings, standing in front of the bathroom mirror a little longer than usual while adjusting his tie and smoothing his hair in ways that felt slightly unfamiliar. None of those details seemed important by themselves, because people change their routines all the time, especially after many years of doing the same things day after day. If anything, I thought it might be a positive sign that he was paying more attention to his appearance, as though he had decided to take better care of himself after years of comfortable habits. Yet I remember one morning when I stood in the doorway watching him adjust his tie for several seconds longer than usual. And for the briefest moment, a strange thought crossed my mind that something about the scene felt unfamiliar. I almost asked him why he suddenly seemed so careful about things that had never mattered before, but the question sounded foolish even inside my own head. So I said nothing, pushed the thought aside, and continued with the quiet routines of the morning the way I always had. The most noticeable change, though I didn't fully understand it at the time, was the way our conversations slowly became shorter and less detailed than they had once been. In the early years of our marriage, we used to talk about nearly everything, from work frustrations to neighborhood gossip to small plans for the weekend. And those conversations filled the quiet spaces of our evenings together. But gradually, I began noticing that he answered questions with shorter responses, sometimes nodding while staring at the television or glancing at the clock as though he were thinking about something else entirely. When I asked about his day, he often gave the same brief answer, saying it had been fine or that nothing interesting had happened. And then the conversation would drift into silence more quickly than it used to. At first, I assumed he was simply tired from work or distracted by the ordinary pressures that come and go throughout adult life. After all, long marriages go through periods where conversation becomes less energetic, and I believed this was just one of those natural phases. What I did not realize then was that silence can sometimes reveal more than words do, especially when it begins appearing where conversation once lived comfortably. I remember sitting across from him at dinner one evening and noticing how quiet the room felt, the sound of our forks against the plates echoing more loudly than usual in the small kitchen. That moment should have made me pause and wonder why the rhythm of our life felt slightly different. But like most people who trust the person sitting across from them, I simply assumed that whatever had changed would eventually return to normal. What I didn't yet understand was that while I was busy explaining those small changes away, something else was already quietly unfolding beyond my view. And by the time I finally realized what had been happening during those ordinary evenings, the truth was already standing in front of me. The truth about discovering another woman is that it rarely happens in the dramatic way people expect. with shouting arguments or obvious evidence falling suddenly into your hands. Most of the time, the realization arrives quietly, almost gently, like a puzzle piece sliding into place after weeks of small, confusing details. For me, that moment came on a Thursday afternoon when I was folding laundry in the bedroom, performing one of those ordinary tasks that fill the spaces of a long marriage without ever feeling important. His jacket was draped over the back of the chair where he had left it the night before, and when I picked it up to hang it in the closet, something small slipped from the inside pocket and landed softly on the carpet. At first, I thought it was just a receipt or a folded piece of paper from work, but when I bent down to pick it up, I saw that it was a restaurant bill from a place we had never visited together. The total wasn't unusual, and there was nothing dramatic about the receipt itself, but two details made me pause for a moment longer than necessary. The first was the date, which showed he had been there the previous evening during the hours he told me he was staying late at the office. The second detail was much smaller, but it was the one that made the quiet room feel suddenly different. Written neatly in blue ink at the bottom of the receipt was a short note from the waitress that said, "Thank you both, hope to see you again." For several seconds, I simply stood there holding the receipt in my hand, not feeling angry or shocked in the way people imagine when they hear stories about betrayal. Instead, the feeling that settled over me was something much calmer and stranger, almost like recognition arriving after a long delay. All the small changes I had been noticing during the past months suddenly arranged themselves in my mind in a new and uncomfortable pattern. The later evenings at work, the new shirts, the distracted conversations at dinner, the extra time he spent in front of the bathroom mirror each morning. None of those details had seemed important on their own, but now they fit together in a way that made quiet sense. I remember sitting down on the edge of the bed with the receipt still in my hand, staring at the simple words written in blue ink, and realizing that this was probably not the first dinner he had shared with someone else. The thought should have made me furious, but instead it created a slow, heavy understanding that settled in my chest like a weight I had been carrying without noticing. I wasn't even sure who the woman was yet, but somehow I already knew she existed. And once that realization appeared, it was impossible to pretend the small changes in our life meant nothing anymore. I didn't confront him that evening when he came home from work, because by then the quiet certainty inside my mind had replaced the need for immediate answers. Instead, I watched him move through the kitchen with the same familiar habits he had carried for years, placing his keys on the counter and loosening his tie while asking what I had made for dinner. There was something strangely surreal about the scene, because he behaved exactly the way he always had, as though nothing in our marriage had shifted at all. While we ate, he spoke casually about a project at the office, describing the usual frustrations and minor successes that filled his workdays, and I listened the way I always had while noticing how easily the story came to him. For the first time in our marriage, I found myself wondering how many of those explanations had been true and how many had been invented simply because they were convenient. I didn't mention the receipt, and he didn't give any sign that he suspected I knew something had changed between us. The entire evening unfolded in the calm rhythm of an ordinary night, yet underneath that quiet routine something new had settled into my thoughts. I knew there was another woman somewhere in his life now, even if I hadn't seen her face or heard her name yet. But strangely enough, discovering the affair itself did not turn out to be the moment that changed my life forever. Because a few days later, when he finally spoke the words that ended our marriage, the sentence he chose to say mattered far more than the betrayal that came before it. A few days passed after I found the receipt before my husband finally spoke about the other woman, and those days were strangely quiet in ways that felt heavier than any argument could have been. We moved around each other in the house with the same familiar routines we had followed for years, yet there was an invisible tension hanging in the air that neither of us acknowledged directly. I remember noticing how carefully normal he tried to behave, asking ordinary questions about dinner or the weather as though the rhythm of our life had not already shifted in ways that could never return to what they once were. For my part, I said very little, not because I was afraid of the conversation, but because something inside me had already begun preparing for it in a quiet, patient way. Sometimes when people imagine betrayal, they expect a moment of explosive confrontation, but that is not how it unfolded in our house. Instead, the truth arrived gradually, like a storm approaching so slowly that you can watch the clouds gathering long before the rain begins. By the third evening after I found the receipt, I knew the conversation was finally coming because he kept glancing toward me with an expression that looked almost rehearsed. After dinner, he stood by the kitchen counter for a long moment, turning his coffee mug slowly in his hands as though he were searching for the right words to begin. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming quietly behind us, and I realized that whatever he was about to say had probably been decided days or even weeks earlier. Then he took a slow breath and looked at me directly for the first time in several minutes, and I knew the moment had finally arrived. "I suppose you've already figured it out," he said, his voice calm in a way that sounded strangely detached from the situation we were standing inside. He spoke the words carefully, like someone stepping through a script they had already practiced in their mind, and I noticed that he did not sound particularly ashamed or nervous. Instead, there was a kind of tired certainty in his voice, as though the decision had already been made long before this conversation began. I did not ask who she was or how long the relationship had been happening, because by then those details felt less important than the quiet understanding that our marriage had already been replaced by something else in his life. He explained the situation in simple terms, saying he had met someone who made him feel different about the future, someone who made him realize that the life we had built together was no longer the one he wanted to continue living. The explanation sounded almost gentle on the surface, the kind of carefully chosen language people often use when they want their betrayal to appear reasonable rather than cruel. While he spoke, I found myself watching his face closely, noticing how calm he seemed while describing the collapse of 24 years of shared history. I remember thinking that if a stranger had walked into the kitchen at that moment, they might have mistaken the conversation for a discussion about moving to a different neighborhood rather than ending a marriage. When he finished explaining, he paused for a moment as though waiting for some kind of emotional response from me. Instead, I simply nodded once, letting the silence settle between us again. Then he said the sentence that ended our marriage. "I'm leaving," he told me quietly, in the same steady tone he had used throughout the conversation, as though those two words were merely the natural conclusion of everything he had just explained. For a moment, I watched him standing there beside the kitchen counter, realizing that the man who had shared my life for nearly a quarter of a century had already stepped mentally into a future where I did not exist. What surprised him most was not that I understood the meaning of his words, but the way I responded to them. Instead of shouting or crying or asking him to reconsider, I simply smiled at him across the table, and the confusion on his face revealed that he had expected something entirely different. The truth is that the moment he said he was leaving, something inside me closed quietly in a way I did not fully understand until years later. Trust did not shatter dramatically the way people imagine. It simply disappeared, like a door quietly locking behind you without any warning. He stood there staring at me for a few seconds, clearly unsettled by the calmness of my reaction, as though my lack of anger had somehow disrupted the version of the story he had prepared in his mind. Eventually, he turned away and walked toward the bedroom to pack a small suitcase, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the faint smell of coffee and the quiet ticking of the clock above the stove. I remained sitting at the table while he moved through the bedroom down the hallway, listening to the soft sounds of drawers opening and closing as he gathered a few things together. It was during those quiet minutes, while he was folding shirts and placing them into his suitcase, that he spoke the sentence I have remembered more clearly than anything else from that night. He said it casually from the other room, almost as if he were commenting on the weather rather than ending a marriage that had lasted nearly half his life. "You'll be fine," he called out, his voice carrying down the hallway toward the kitchen. "Women like you always are." At the time, I did not fully understand why those words felt heavier than everything he had said before, but something about them settled into my memory with an uncomfortable weight. Over the years that followed, I would realize that the moment he announced he was leaving was not the part of that evening that changed me the most. The sentence he spoke afterward, so casually and without hesitation, would turn out to matter far more than the end of the marriage itself. Because sometimes the words people choose when they think they are explaining a decision reveal far more than they ever intended. And in the decades that followed, those simple words would quietly shape the way I looked at every man I met afterward. The days immediately after the divorce were quieter than I expected, not in the peaceful way people sometimes describe new beginnings, but in the strange, hollow way that follows the end of something familiar. After 24 years of marriage, even the smallest routines carried memories of another person moving through the same rooms, and it took time for the house to adjust to the absence of those quiet habits. His shoes were no longer beside the door in the mornings, the second coffee cup remained untouched in the cabinet, and the chair where he used to read the newspaper at breakfast sat empty in a way that felt oddly noticeable. At first, I continued moving through my days almost automatically, completing chores and errands the same way I always had, as though routine itself might soften the shock of what had happened. Friends called often during those first weeks, offering the kind of sympathy people give when they assume someone has been deeply wounded, and I appreciated their kindness even though I did not feel broken in the way they seemed to expect. What surprised most people was how calm I appeared, because instead of anger or grief, I felt something much quieter settling into my life. It was not relief exactly, but it was not devastation either. The marriage had ended with a sentence spoken across the kitchen table, and once those words were said, the future seemed strangely clear in ways that were difficult to explain. For the first time in many years, my life belonged entirely to me again, even if I did not yet know what I intended to do with that freedom. In the months that followed, I began rebuilding the structure of my days one small decision at a time, discovering that independence has its own rhythm once you learn how to live inside it. I rearranged the furniture in the living room so the space no longer reminded me of the way it looked during our marriage, and I painted the kitchen a soft shade of blue that my husband had never liked. These were small changes, almost trivial in the larger picture of life, but they gave the house a different feeling, as though the rooms themselves were slowly adjusting to a new version of the future. I returned to hobbies I had neglected during the later years of the marriage, reading novels in the evenings and taking long walks through the neighborhood after dinner. Neighbors sometimes asked gentle questions about how I was doing, their voices carrying the careful tone people use when they suspect someone might still be fragile. I always answered honestly that I was doing fine, and over time that answer stopped surprising them. The truth was that I had begun to understand something important during those quiet months. Losing a marriage does not necessarily mean losing yourself, especially when the ending reveals things about the relationship you had never fully seen before. The sentence my husband spoke the night he left continued to echo in my thoughts from time to time, not because it caused pain anymore, but because it had changed the way I understood trust. Years passed, and the sharp edges of the divorce slowly softened into distant memory, the way most life events eventually do. I built a stable routine for myself, one that felt comfortable and peaceful in ways my married life had not always been during its final years. People occasionally suggested that I might consider dating again, offering cheerful encouragement as though companionship were the obvious next step after a divorce. Their advice was always well-meaning, but it never felt particularly relevant to the life I had quietly created for myself. Something subtle had shifted inside me the night my husband left, something that could not easily return to the way it had been before. I did not feel bitter toward men in general, nor did I carry anger toward my former husband as the years went by. Instead, what remained was a calm understanding about the nature of trust and how fragile it can be once certain words are spoken. That understanding stayed with me through the decades that followed, shaping the choices I made and the relationships I allowed into my life. And although I rarely spoke about the divorce anymore, the sentence he said that night continued to linger in my memory like a quiet lesson I had learned too well. Because sometimes a single moment does more than end a marriage. Sometimes it quietly changes the way you see people for the rest of your life. For many years after the divorce, I never seriously considered the idea of dating again, not because I had made a dramatic promise to myself, but simply because the thought rarely crossed my mind in any meaningful way. Life had settled into a calm rhythm that felt complete enough on its own, and I had grown comfortable with the quiet independence that came from making decisions without having to consider another person's expectations. Still, time has a way of softening even the firmest assumptions about the future, and eventually friends began suggesting that perhaps it might be healthy to meet someone new. Their suggestions were never forceful, but they appeared often enough in conversation that one evening I finally agreed to try something different. A neighbor of mine had been organizing small community dinners for people who lived nearby, casual gatherings where strangers shared a table and conversation without any pressure attached to the evening. She mentioned that one of the guests was a man recently widowed who seemed kind and thoughtful, and she gently asked if I might like to come along. At first I hesitated, not because I was afraid, but because the idea felt strangely unfamiliar after so many years of living independently. Still, curiosity has its own quiet power, and eventually I decided there was no real harm in attending a dinner with a few neighbors and seeing what the evening might bring. The dinner itself was pleasant in the comfortable, slightly awkward way that gatherings with new people often are, filled with polite introductions and conversations that gradually loosen as the evening goes on. The man my neighbor had mentioned was named Robert, and he turned out to be exactly the sort of person people describe as nice, a word that sometimes sounds simple but often hides a genuine kindness beneath it. He spoke calmly about his life, mentioning his late wife with a quiet respect that suggested their marriage had been a good one, and he asked thoughtful questions about my own experiences without sounding intrusive. Throughout the evening, we talked about ordinary things, books we had read recently, the changing weather, the small details of daily life that people use to build the early stages of conversation. There was nothing uncomfortable about the interaction, and in fact, I found myself enjoying the quiet rhythm of the discussion more than I expected. For the first time in many years, I could imagine what it might feel like to sit across from someone new and share pieces of life again without the weight of old memories standing between us. When the dinner ended, Robert asked politely if I might like to have coffee sometime the following week, and I heard myself agreeing before I had fully considered the decision. The invitation was simple, almost casual, yet as I walked home that night, I realized that I had just taken the first small step back into a part of life I had quietly left behind decades earlier. Over the next few days, I thought occasionally about the upcoming coffee meeting, not with nervousness, but with a kind of calm curiosity about what the experience might feel like after so many years away from dating. Part of me wondered whether the long gap since my divorce had changed the way I looked at relationships, or whether the old instincts about trust and companionship would return naturally once the situation appeared again. When the day finally arrived, we met at a small cafe near the park, the kind of place where people linger over quiet conversations while watching the afternoon light move slowly across the windows. Robert greeted me warmly, and the early moments of the conversation felt just as comfortable as they had during the dinner a week earlier. Yet somewhere during that meeting, while he was describing a trip he had taken with friends the previous summer, I noticed a subtle shift in my own thoughts that surprised me. It wasn't anything he said or did that caused the feeling. In fact, he remained exactly the same kind and thoughtful person I had met at the dinner. The change happened quietly inside my own mind, when I realized that a small part of me was already studying every sentence he spoke, measuring it against a question I hadn't consciously intended to ask. It was the kind of careful observation that grows out of experience rather than suspicion, a habit of listening closely for meanings that might hide beneath ordinary words. I finished my coffee and thanked him for the pleasant conversation, genuinely appreciating his company while also recognizing something about myself that had not changed over the years. Because as I walked home through the park afterward, I understood that my husband's departure decades earlier had left behind more than just the memory of a broken marriage. It had quietly changed the way I listened to every man who spoke to me afterward. It had been several years since the divorce when I first heard that my former husband had remarried, and the news arrived in the quiet, casual way that most pieces of information travel through a small community. I was standing in line at the grocery store one afternoon when an old acquaintance from church greeted me warmly and asked how I had been doing. Our conversation was polite and ordinary at first, filled with the usual exchanges about weather, neighborhood changes, and mutual friends we hadn't seen in a while. Then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that she had recently attended a wedding reception for someone I used to know very well. When she said my former husband's name, she did so carefully, as though unsure how I might react to hearing it after so many years. For a moment, I simply nodded, letting the information settle quietly into the conversation without interrupting her explanation. She described the event briefly, mentioning that the ceremony had been small but pleasant, and that his new wife seemed cheerful and friendly. There was no awkwardness in her tone, just the mild curiosity people often feel when they believe they might be sharing news that could surprise someone else. I thanked her for telling me and wished them well, because that seemed like the natural response to something that had happened so long after our own marriage had ended. As I walked through the parking lot afterward, carrying 2 bags of groceries and thinking about the conversation I had just had, I noticed that the news did not affect me in the way people might expect. There was no sudden rush of jealousy or anger, and I did not feel the old sting of betrayal returning to the surface of my thoughts. Instead, the feeling that appeared was something much calmer, almost reflective, as though I were considering a chapter of life that had already closed many years earlier. His decision to marry again seemed like a logical continuation of the path he had chosen the night he left our house with a suitcase and a few quiet explanations. In fact, the information confirmed something I had already suspected about the way he approached relationships. My former husband had always been the kind of man who preferred companionship to solitude, someone who believed life worked best when shared with another person. During our marriage, that belief had once made sense to me because I had shared it without questioning it. But the years since the divorce had slowly revealed that people carry very different expectations into relationships, even when they appear to want the same things on the surface. Later that evening, after I had finished putting away the groceries and settled into my usual chair by the window with a cup of tea, I thought again about the brief conversation in the grocery store and the casual way the news had been delivered. It occurred to me that my former husband had moved forward with his life in exactly the way most people do after a divorce, building new routines and new relationships while the past slowly faded into memory. There was nothing particularly surprising about the fact that he had married again, and I felt no resentment toward him or his new wife as I considered the story. What interested me more was the quiet realization that our 2 lives had taken completely different directions after the same moment of separation. He had chosen to rebuild the kind of life we once shared together, while I had discovered something else entirely in the years that followed. Sitting there by the window, watching the evening light settle across the quiet street outside, I understood that his second marriage was simply another step in the path he had chosen long ago. And strangely enough, hearing about that wedding reminded me less about the end of our own marriage than about the words he spoke that night before he walked out the door. Because even decades later, those few casual words still explained far more about the future than either of us had realized at the time. After hearing about my former husband's second marriage, life continued moving forward in its usual quiet rhythm, and for the most part, I thought about him less and less as the years passed. Time has a way of softening the sharp edges of old stories, especially when those stories no longer have any direct connection to your daily life. Occasionally, though, small pieces of news about him would reach me through the same casual channels where most community gossip travels. A mutual acquaintance might mention seeing him at a restaurant across town, or someone from church would remark that he and his wife had moved into a different neighborhood. These details were never shared with any sense of drama, and I listened to them with the same calm detachment someone might feel when hearing about a distant relative they rarely see anymore. It surprised some people that I never asked many questions about his life, but curiosity about his choices had quietly faded after the divorce. Instead, I treated those occasional updates as simple reminders that our two lives had continued moving in completely separate directions. When I thought about him at all, it was usually in the reflective way people remember someone who once played an important role in their past, but no longer occupies the same place in their present. A few years after his second marriage, I happened to see him unexpectedly one afternoon while I was walking through the town square. It was one of those small moments that might have felt dramatic in another life, but in reality it unfolded with surprising calmness. I was crossing the street near the cafe when I noticed him standing outside a bookstore with a woman I assumed was his new wife. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the sidewalk, and I saw a flicker of recognition pass across his face before he quickly looked away. The encounter lasted only a few seconds, yet it carried a strange sense of distance, as though we were two strangers who happened to share a memory neither of us intended to revisit. He appeared older than I remembered, his hair beginning to gray at the temples, but otherwise he looked very much the same as the man who had once stood in our kitchen and calmly announced that he was leaving. I continued walking without slowing down, and he did the same, each of us moving quietly in opposite directions. There was no need for conversation or explanation, because whatever had once existed between us had already finished its story years earlier. Later that evening, as I sat by the window watching the neighborhood settle into its usual nighttime quiet, I found myself thinking about that brief encounter in the town square. What struck me most about the moment was not the memory of our marriage, or even the fact that he was now living a completely different life with someone else. Instead, what stayed with me was the realization that the emotional weight of that past had faded far more than I ever expected. Seeing him again had not reopened old wounds or stirred feelings of regret. It had simply confirmed something I had slowly understood over the years. Some relationships end in ways that feel dramatic at the time, yet eventually they become nothing more than distant chapters in a life that continues to move forward. Still, as calm as that understanding felt, there was one detail from our shared history that remained surprisingly clear in my memory. The sentence he spoke the night he left our house had never completely faded, even after decades had passed. And as I thought about the brief moment our eyes met across the street that afternoon, I realized something else quietly surprising. Watching his life from a distance had taught me that the words people say when they think a story is ending often reveal the truth about how it will continue. I first heard about my former husband's second divorce on an ordinary afternoon when a neighbor stopped by for coffee and casually mentioned that his marriage had ended a few months earlier. She said it in the same tone people use when sharing community news that feels mildly surprising, but no longer personal after so many years have passed. According to what she had heard, the relationship had quietly unraveled after only a few years, and the separation had been handled without much public drama. I listened politely while she explained the story, stirring sugar slowly into my cup while considering how strange it felt to hear about his life as if it belonged to someone I barely knew anymore. There was a time when the details of his decisions would have mattered deeply to me, when every change in his life might have stirred questions or emotions I could not easily ignore. But decades had a way of reshaping perspective, and by then his choices felt more like distant headlines than personal news. My neighbor finished her story with a small shrug and said she supposed marriages sometimes simply run their course. I nodded and agreed in a calm voice, because there was nothing else to say about a relationship that had already ended years before it ever reached my ears. Several months later, I heard another update, this time from a friend at church who seemed slightly amused by the news she was sharing. She leaned across the table during a quiet moment after service and told me that my former husband had remarried again, this time to someone noticeably younger than either of the two wives who had come before her. The information was delivered with the kind of curious tone people use when a story begins to sound familiar in a slightly predictable way. According to what she had heard, the wedding had been modest, attended mostly by people from his newer circle of friends rather than the community we once shared together. I smiled politely while she spoke, recognizing the quiet pattern that seemed to follow his life from a distance. 3 marriages, each beginning with the same hopeful belief that a fresh start might somehow lead to a different ending. There was something almost optimistic about that approach to life, even if experience suggested that repeating the same story rarely changes the way it concludes. When my friend finished describing the wedding, she looked at me for a moment with the thoughtful curiosity people sometimes feel when they realize they are speaking to someone connected to the story. Then she asked a question that caught me slightly off guard, though her voice remained gentle when she said it. "Did you ever think about marrying again?" she asked quietly, tilting her head with the careful expression of someone who hopes the question will not sound intrusive. For a brief moment, I simply looked at her across the table, considering how simple the question seemed on the surface and how complicated the answer had quietly become over the years. People had asked similar things before, usually with friendly intentions, but rarely had anyone asked it so directly. I told her honestly that I had thought about it once or twice in the years after the divorce, but that life had gradually taken a different direction for me. She nodded thoughtfully and said she supposed that after a marriage lasting so many years, it must be difficult to imagine beginning again with someone new. I did not disagree with her, though the truth was slightly more complicated than that explanation. The decision had never been about difficulty or bitterness, and it certainly had not been about holding on to the past longer than necessary. Instead, it had grown slowly from a realization that began forming on the night my husband walked out of our kitchen with his suitcase. Over the years that followed, that realization settled quietly into the way I looked at every relationship I might have started. Later that evening, after I returned home and the house settled back into its usual quiet stillness, I thought again about the conversation at church and the question my friend had asked so casually. Hearing about his 3rd marriage had not stirred jealousy or regret, but it had reminded me of the different paths our lives had taken since the moment our own marriage ended. While he had continued searching for companionship in one relationship after another, I had spent those same years building a life that did not depend on that kind of trust. Sitting by the window with the lights dimmed and the quiet street stretching beyond the glass, I realized that the answer to my friend's question had actually begun forming decades earlier. It started with the words my husband spoke the night he left, words that seemed simple at the time but carried a meaning I would only fully understand much later. Because the truth is that my marriage did not end simply because another woman appeared in his life. It ended because of something far more revealing that he said when he thought he was explaining his decision. And by the time I finally understood what those words meant, I had already realized why I would never fully trust another man again. When my friend at church asked why I had never remarried, I realized that the answer was not something that could be explained with a single sentence, even though the reason itself had begun with one. Most people assume that after a painful divorce, someone either becomes bitter or afraid of being hurt again, but that was never quite what happened to me. The years after my husband left were not filled with anger or resentment, and I did not spend my time thinking about revenge or regret. Instead, what remained from that night was something quieter and more complicated, a kind of understanding that slowly shaped the way I looked at people. At first, I thought the divorce itself had changed me, because ending a marriage after 24 years is the sort of experience that naturally alters the way someone views relationships. But the longer I lived with the memory of that evening, the clearer it became that the marriage ending was not the part that had truly stayed with me. What lingered was the sentence he spoke from the bedroom while packing his suitcase, the one he delivered so casually that it almost sounded like encouragement. "You'll be fine," he had called out down the hallway. "Women like you always are." At the time, those words seemed harmless, maybe even intended to soften the blow of what he had already told me in the kitchen. Yet over the years, I realized that sentence revealed something about the way he saw me and about the way he understood the world. For a long time, I tried to decide what exactly he meant when he said those words, because they carried a tone that was difficult to interpret in the moment. On the surface, it sounded like reassurance, as if he believed I was strong enough to survive the end of our marriage without falling apart. But there was another meaning hiding beneath the calm delivery of that sentence, something I could only understand after watching the pattern of his life unfold in the years that followed. What he meant was not that I would be fine because I was strong, but that I would be fine because he believed I was the kind of woman who would quietly accept what had happened and move forward without asking too many questions. In his mind, I was dependable in a way that made his decision easier, someone who would absorb the consequences of his choices without disrupting the future he had already decided to pursue. The realization did not come all at once, but slowly, piece by piece, as I thought about the calm confidence in his voice when he said it. That confidence was not based on love or respect, but on a certain assumption about who I was and what I would tolerate. Once I understood that, the sentence stopped sounding like reassurance and began to feel like something very different. It was not meant to comfort me, it was meant to justify his own departure. That understanding changed the way I listened to men afterward, because it revealed how easily someone can hide their assumptions behind ordinary words. When people speak, they often believe they are explaining a decision or describing a situation, but sometimes they are also revealing the quiet beliefs that guide their choices. In the years after the divorce, I occasionally met men who were kind, thoughtful, and perfectly capable of offering companionship. Yet every conversation carried a small question in the back of my mind, a quiet habit of listening for the meaning beneath the surface of what was being said. It was not suspicion exactly, and it was certainly not bitterness. Instead, it was a kind of awareness that comes from realizing how much of a person's character can be revealed in a single unguarded sentence. My husband had not intended to leave behind a lesson that night when he walked out of the house with his suitcase. But the words he chose to say had quietly reshaped the way I understood trust, respect, and the assumptions people carry into relationships. And once you learn to hear those things clearly, it becomes much harder to ignore them. That is why the answer to my friend's question was never as simple as saying I had lost faith in love or decided that marriage was not worth the risk. The truth is that I never stopped believing people are capable of kindness or loyalty, because life offers plenty of examples proving that those qualities exist. What changed was something more subtle, a shift in the way I measured the quiet intentions behind someone's words. Over time, I realized that trust is not built only on affection or shared history, but also on the deeper respect two people carry for each other's independence and dignity. Once I recognized how easily that respect can disappear beneath polite explanations and convenient assumptions, I found it difficult to return to the kind of trust I had once offered without question. My life after the divorce became peaceful in ways I had not expected, shaped by friendships, routines, and a sense of independence that felt honest and stable. And although people often wondered why I never tried again to build another romantic relationship, the answer had been quietly decided long ago. Because sometimes a single sentence does more than end a marriage. Sometimes it changes the way you understand every promise that might come afterward. In the years that followed the divorce, the life I built for myself did not arrive suddenly or dramatically, the way people often imagine independence beginning after the end of a marriage. Instead, it grew slowly, almost quietly, through hundreds of small decisions that gradually reshaped the way my days looked and felt. At first, those changes were simple practical adjustments, the kind that naturally happen when one person begins living in a house that once belonged to two. I rearranged the furniture so the rooms no longer felt organized around someone else's habits, and I filled empty shelves with books and photographs that reflected the life I was building rather than the one that had ended. The mornings became calmer without the rush of preparing two schedules instead of one, and evenings settled into a rhythm of reading, walking through the neighborhood, or sharing quiet conversations with friends who had remained part of my life for many years. What surprised me most during that time was how natural the transition eventually felt, as though independence had been waiting patiently beneath the surface of my old routines. I had spent so long believing that stability required another person's presence that it took time to realize how steady life could feel on its own. Slowly, the house that once echoed with memories of a marriage began to feel entirely like mine again. As the years passed, I discovered that living alone did not mean living a smaller life, something people often assume when they hear about someone who never remarried. In fact, the freedom that came with independence opened space for experiences I might never have explored before. I began volunteering at the local library several afternoons each week, helping organize community events and meeting people whose stories were very different from my own. Through those quiet conversations, I learned that everyone carries their own complicated history of relationships, choices, and unexpected turns that shape the direction of their lives. I also spent more time traveling than I ever had during my marriage, taking short trips to nearby towns simply to explore unfamiliar places and enjoy the peaceful feeling of moving through the world on my own terms. None of those experiences were dramatic or life-changing in the way people sometimes describe personal reinvention, yet together they formed a life that felt balanced and honest. The independence I discovered was not about proving that I could live without someone else, but about realizing that happiness does not always depend on sharing every part of your life with another person. Once that understanding settled comfortably into my routine, the idea of loneliness no longer held the same meaning it once had. Friends occasionally asked whether I ever felt regret about the path I had chosen, especially as the decades passed, and many of them watched their own families grow through children and grandchildren. I always answered honestly that my life had turned out differently than I once expected, but not in a way that felt incomplete or empty. The truth was that the quiet stability I built after the divorce allowed me to understand myself in ways I might never have discovered inside the structure of my old marriage. There was a calm confidence that came from knowing my life moved forward because of my own choices rather than someone else's decisions. The sentence my husband spoke the night he left remained part of my memory, but it no longer carried the same weight it once had during those early years. Instead, it became something like a turning point, a moment that redirected the course of my life toward a future I had never originally imagined. Looking back now, I can see that the independence I built afterward was not the result of bitterness or fear. It was simply the natural outcome of understanding who I had become once the old version of my life ended. Sometimes in the evening, I still sit by the same window where I once thought about the future after hearing that sentence echo down the hallway from the bedroom. The street outside has changed over the decades, with new families moving into houses that once belonged to people I knew well, yet the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood remains familiar in a comforting way. When I look back on the life I built alone, I do not see a story defined by loss or abandonment. Instead, I see a path that gradually revealed a kind of peace I had not expected to find after the end of a long marriage. The years have shown me that independence can hold its own quiet form of companionship, one that comes from understanding yourself without needing someone else to confirm who you are. And perhaps that is the strange gift hidden inside the ending of my marriage so many decades ago. Because the life I built alone turned out to be stronger, calmer, and more complete than I ever imagined the night my husband said he was leaving. It had been many years since I last saw my former husband when I unexpectedly ran into him again on a quiet autumn afternoon. The moment arrived so casually that it almost felt like one of those small coincidences life occasionally arranges when you least expect it. I had stopped at a small bookstore downtown, the kind of place with narrow aisles and tall wooden shelves that smelled faintly of paper and coffee. I was standing near the front counter, flipping through a novel I was considering buying, when the door opened behind me and someone stepped inside. At first, I didn't pay any attention to the sound, because people came and went through that door all afternoon. But as I turned slightly to place the book back on the shelf, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the entrance, scanning the store with the casual curiosity of someone visiting for the first time. For a moment, it took my mind a second to catch up with what my eyes had already recognized. The man standing there, older now with thinner hair and a slower way of moving, was the same person who had once stood in my kitchen and calmly told me he was leaving. Time had softened the sharp details of his appearance, Yet something about the way he carried himself was still unmistakably familiar. He saw me a moment later, and I watched the quiet recognition appear across his face in the same way it had all those years ago when we briefly passed each other in the town square. This time, though, neither of us looked away immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the aisle where I was standing, his expression carrying a mixture of curiosity and hesitation that suggested he was deciding whether to speak. When he reached the end of the shelf, he stopped a few feet away and offered a small, polite smile, the kind people exchange when they meet an old acquaintance whose place in their life has long since changed. We greeted each other simply, using the kind of careful friendliness people adopt when the past between them is too complicated to summarize in a quick conversation. He asked how I had been doing, and I answered honestly that life had been good to me in the years since we last spoke. There was no tension in the exchange, no hidden resentment beneath the calm tone of our voices. Instead, the conversation felt strangely ordinary, as though we were two people discussing familiar topics rather than two former spouses meeting again after decades apart. As we spoke, I noticed how much time had reshaped the person standing in front of me. His voice was softer than I remembered, and the confident certainty he once carried in his manner had been replaced by something quieter and more reflective. He mentioned that he had moved to a smaller house after retiring, and that life had become slower in ways he had not expected when he was younger. There was no mention of his marriages or the women who had been part of his life after ours ended, and I did not ask about them. Instead, we talked about ordinary things, the changes in the town, mutual acquaintances who had moved away, and the way the neighborhood had slowly evolved over the years. At one point, he laughed softly about how quickly time seemed to pass once people reached a certain age, and I found myself agreeing with him in a way that felt natural rather than nostalgic. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, yet it carried a calm clarity that surprised me. Standing there in the quiet aisle of the bookstore, I realized that whatever had once connected us belonged entirely to another lifetime. Before leaving, he paused for a moment as though considering whether there was something else he wanted to say. For a brief second, I wondered if he might mention the night our marriage ended or the words that had lingered in my memory for so many years afterward. But instead, he simply nodded once, thanked me for the conversation, and walked toward the front door of the store. I watched him step outside into the late afternoon sunlight, noticing how slowly he moved now compared to the man I once knew. When the door closed behind him, the bookstore returned to its quiet stillness, and I picked up the novel I had been holding a few minutes earlier. What struck me most about that unexpected meeting was not the memory of our marriage or the long years that had passed since it ended. It was the calm realization that the sentence he spoke on the night he left had finally lost its power over the way I lived my life. Seeing him again made something very clear to me in a way that decades of reflection never fully had before. Because sometimes the final step in leaving the past behind is simply recognizing that the person who once changed your life no longer holds the same place in it. A few weeks passed after that unexpected meeting in the bookstore, and for a while I assumed it would remain nothing more than a brief coincidence, the kind of quiet moment that appears unexpectedly and then disappears again into the rhythm of everyday life. But one afternoon, while I was sitting by the window reading, the phone rang with a number I did not immediately recognize. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another routine call from someone selling insurance or offering services I had no interest in, but something about the hesitation before the second ring made me reach for the receiver anyway. When I answered, there was a short pause on the other end of the line before a familiar voice spoke my name. It took only a moment for me to recognize it, even though decades had passed since we had last spoken directly to each other. My former husband sounded older, of course, but there was also something else in his tone that I had never heard before. It was quieter, less certain, as if the confidence that once shaped his decisions had slowly faded over the years. For a moment, neither of us said much, simply acknowledging the strange situation of hearing each other's voices again after such a long time. Then he explained that he had been thinking about our brief conversation in the bookstore and felt there was something he should have said that day, but had not found the right moment to express. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully in a way that suggested he had rehearsed the conversation many times before dialing the number. He said that seeing me again had reminded him of the life we once shared and of the years that followed after he walked out of our house with a suitcase and a decision he believed was certain. At first, his explanation sounded similar to the kind of reflections people offer when they look back on the past with the clarity that only time can provide. But gradually, the conversation shifted into something more honest than I expected. He admitted that the marriages that followed ours had not turned out the way he imagined when he left all those years ago. Each new beginning had carried the same hopeful belief that life would feel simpler and more exciting with someone different beside him. Yet over time, the same quiet difficulties had returned in ways he could not fully explain. Listening to him speak, I realized that he was not asking for sympathy or forgiveness. Instead, he seemed to be describing a realization that had arrived slowly after many years of repeating the same choices. For the first time since I had known him, his voice carried the tone of someone who had begun questioning his own understanding of the world. After a moment of silence, he finally mentioned the sentence he spoke on the night our marriage ended, the one that had stayed in my memory long after everything else from that evening faded. He said he had thought about those words many times over the years and had only recently begun to understand what they revealed about the way he once viewed relationships. At the time, he believed he was offering reassurance, telling me I would be fine because he assumed I was strong enough to rebuild my life after he left. But as the decades passed, he realized that his confidence had come from something much less generous than he originally believed. He had assumed I would quietly accept the consequences of his decision because he expected stability from me while he continued searching for something else. That understanding, he admitted, had taken a long time to recognize because it required him to look honestly at the pattern his life had followed after our divorce. By the time he finished speaking, the room around me had grown very quiet, and I found myself looking out the window at the same peaceful street where I had spent so many years building a different kind of life. What surprised me most about that conversation was not the apology that eventually followed, but the calm clarity that came with hearing him finally describe the truth he had spent decades learning. His words carried no dramatic emotion, only the quiet tone of someone who had finally reached an understanding that could not be undone. When he finished speaking, I thanked him for calling and for saying what he felt needed to be said, because in that moment there was nothing else either of us needed to add. The years between us had already answered the questions that once seemed so important on the night our marriage ended. After we said goodbye and I placed the receiver back on the table, I sat for a long moment in the same quiet room where my life had slowly unfolded after the divorce. And as I watched the afternoon light settle across the floor, I realized that his phone call had confirmed something I had already understood for a very long time. Because sometimes the truth people spend years searching for arrives too late to change anything except their own understanding of the past. By the time I reached the later years of my life, I had already understood something that took my former husband decades to recognize. The night he left our marriage was never the tragedy people assumed it must have been. For many years after the divorce, friends quietly expected that one day I might look back with regret, wondering whether my life would have been happier if things had turned out differently. But the truth became clearer with each passing year. The ending of that marriage had not taken something away from my life. It had simply revealed a different path that I might never have discovered otherwise. At first, I did not understand how steady life could feel without the structure of a marriage I had once believed would last forever. Yet over time, the quiet independence I built proved stronger than the certainty I once thought marriage provided. My days slowly filled with routines, friendships, and choices that belonged entirely to me. What began as an unexpected ending gradually turned into a life that felt calmer and more honest than the one I had lived before. And somewhere along the way, I realized that the moment people believed had broken my life was actually the moment that quietly set it free. The life I built afterward did not arrive suddenly or dramatically. and it certainly did not resemble the lonely future some people expected for me. Instead, it grew slowly through ordinary days that gradually formed a rhythm I came to trust. I learned to enjoy the peaceful silence of my home in the evenings, the kind of quiet that allows a person to hear their own thoughts clearly without interruption. Friendships deepened over time, and those relationships brought a sense of connection that never depended on promises someone might break. I traveled when I felt curious about a new place, volunteered when I wanted to feel part of the community around me, and built routines that reflected who I had become rather than who I once thought I needed to be. While my former husband continued searching for fulfillment in one marriage after another, I discovered something far simpler and more stable. Happiness did not have to arrive through someone else's presence in my life. Sometimes it appeared in the quiet confidence of knowing that my life moved forward because of my own choices. Once I understood that, the idea that my life had somehow become smaller after the divorce simply stopped making sense. Years later, when my former husband called to apologize for the sentence he spoke the night he left, I realized that the moment had quietly completed the story that began decades earlier in our kitchen. For him, those words had taken years of reflection to fully understand. For me, their meaning had slowly unfolded during the life I built afterward. When he said, "You'll be fine. Women like you always are," he believed he was offering reassurance. But what he actually revealed was the assumption that I would quietly carry the consequences of his decision while he pursued something new. That sentence stayed with me not because it hurt, but because it showed me how easily people misunderstand the strength of someone they believe they already know. Over time, I realized something quietly ironic about those words. He had been right about one thing, though not in the way he intended. I did turn out to be fine. Not because he expected it, and not because he understood me at the time, but because life gave me the chance to build something stronger than the marriage he walked away from. People sometimes ask whether I ever wished things had turned out differently, especially when they hear how long my marriage lasted before it ended so suddenly. They expect hesitation in my answer, as though somewhere deep inside I must carry a hidden regret about the life that might have been. But the truth is much simpler than that. The life I built after he left was not a consolation prize for a marriage that failed. It became the life that allowed me to understand myself more clearly than I ever had before. And that is why, after all these years, I can say something with complete certainty. I never regretted the life I built after he left. Because in the end, the moment that once felt like the closing of my story turned out to be the beginning of the life that was truly meant for me. Before you go, my dear, let me say this. If you stayed with me until the very end, then this story meant something to you. And that tells me you weren't just watching, you were listening with your heart. If it touched you in any way, please take a moment to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and your words mean more to me than you know. This little space we have here is more than just stories. It's a place where we share the lessons life teaches us quietly, and there are many more waiting to be told. So if you'd like to sit with me again, make sure you subscribe and stay close. I would truly love to have you here for the next story. Until then, take gentle care of yourself, and I'll be right here when you come back.